She discovered her husband's affair and bought the seat right next to the couple on the plane. For 20 years, Claire believed her marriage was a granite fortress, solid and impenetrable. Little did she know her husband, the renowned architect Richard, was already drafting its demolition. He had planned a secret romantic trip, a getaway for two in Lisbon, with the woman who was supposed to be just a work colleague. What Richard never imagined was that a single credit card statement left on the kitchen counter would be the spark to set it all ablaze, and that his wife, the woman he considered so predictable, would make the most impulsive decision of her life, buying the seat directly beside them on the plane. This isn't a story about the end of a love affair. It's about a woman who decided to rewrite her own ending. And the first scene of this new story began on a cold, rainy Tuesday night, with the relentless sound of rain against the window pane and the click of a mouse that was about to change everything. The rain hammered against the office window, a constant rhythm that usually calmed her. Claire was immersed in her monthly task, organizing their finances. It was a routine she performed with the precision of a historian cataloging artifacts. Every bill, every receipt, a piece in the mosaic of their shared life. She opened Richard's credit card statement, expecting the usual expenses, business lunches, the gym membership, maybe a book, and then she saw it. A line item that didn't belong in the mosaic, a smudge on the painting. Hotel Palacio de Belmonte, reservation deposit. Her heart skipped a beat. Lisbon? No. Richard had been clear. It's an important conference in Venice, honey. I'm going alone. It'll be exhausting and strictly professional. Her fingers, suddenly trembling, typed the hotel's name into the search bar. The images that filled the screen were not of a soulless corporate convention center. They were suites with silk canopies, private balconies overlooking the Tagus River, and tables set for romantic candlelit dinners. A lover's hideaway, not a place for an architect on a solo work trip. Each photograph was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of trust she had spent 20 years building. The air in her lungs seemed to freeze. She glanced at the picture frame on her desk, at the smiling face of the man she shared her life with, who had suddenly become a complete stranger. In that moment, Claire knew with an overwhelming certainty that the lie about the trip's destination was just the tip of the iceberg. But the truth she was about to uncover was far bigger than a simple change of plans. To understand the depth of that betrayal, you have to understand the woman who discovered it. Claire, at 48, wasn't just a wife. She was a historian. She taught art history to teenagers who spent more time staring at their phones than at the projections of Caravaggio. But she persisted with a quiet faith in the beauty and importance of the past. Her life's great passion, however, the research for her PhD on the Portuguese diaspora, had been carefully tucked away in a desk drawer, like a family heirloom too fragile to handle. She had traded it, willingly at first, for the promise of a brilliant future alongside a young, ambitious architect named Richard, a future she helped build with the same care and methodology she would use to restore an ancient fresco. While Richard erected his glass and steel skyscrapers that redrew the city's skyline, Claire became the invisible architect of their life. She was the one who organized the flawless dinner parties that charmed clients and partners. She was the one who remembered the name and food allergies of every important guest. She was the one who turned the cold, minimalist house he designed into a home that breathed culture and warmth. She became the curator of Richard's personal museum, and slowly, without either of them noticing, she herself became one of the exhibits, the intelligent, cultured, but predictable wife. The solid foundation upon which he could build his dreams without fear of cracks. Claire vividly remembered long nights in the small apartment they shared at the beginning, when he would sit on the floor, genuinely fascinated, listening to her talk about the Roman Empire or Renaissance art. He used to say her mind was the most interesting place he'd ever visited. Now, when she tried to share a historical find from her readings, he would smile with a condescension that wounded her more than any shout. "That's interesting, honey," he'd say, his eyes already glazed over, looking at his phone, his mind miles away. The man she fell in love with saw a universe of possibilities in her. The man she was married to now saw only a comfortable routine, a safe harbor. He had forgotten the passionate young woman who once dreamed of deciphering ancient maps in dusty archives, and worse, perhaps Claire had forgotten her too. But the image of that hotel in Lisbon, so vivid on her computer screen, was like an archaeological dig into her own soul, unearthing an uncomfortable truth. She had become a footnote in her own husband's biography. And the main story, she now understood, was being written without her. And what was the story Claire dreamed of writing for herself? It wasn't an epic of grand conquests or riches. Claire's deepest desire was something much quieter, almost archaeological, the restoration of a partnership. She longed to be, once again, the intellectual accomplice of the man she loved, not just the efficient administrator of his life. She remembered with painful clarity a rainy Saturday, maybe 15 years ago. They were too broke to go out, and they spent the entire day on the living room floor, surrounded by library books and old maps, tracing the routes of the great Portuguese navigations. He, an architect at the start of his career; she, a PhD student full of fire. He didn't see history as a dusty pile of facts. He saw it as she did, a living narrative of power, ambition, and human ingenuity. That day, he looked at her with an admiration that was her own private sun, a warmth that made her feel her mind was the most spectacular place in the world. That sun, over the years, had condensed into a single point of light, a tangible dream, a trip to Portugal. To Richard, it was just another European tourist spot. For Claire, it was a pilgrimage. It was the chance to walk the same cobblestone streets her grandparents had left behind in search of a new life in America. It was the opportunity to visit the archives in Lisbon, to touch centuries-old documents, to smell the scent of old paper and ink. It was the living promise that the historian inside her hadn't died, but was merely dormant, waiting to be awakened. It was the materialization of her abandoned PhD. But every time she proposed the trip, Richard's response was another nail in the coffin of that dream. At first, they were gentle postponements. "Next year, babe, I promise. As soon as I close that big project, we'll celebrate there," he'd say, and she'd believe him. Then the excuses became more pragmatic. "Claire, now, with the kids' tuition, the house renovation, it's not the right time. We have to be responsible." And finally, in recent years, came the condescension, the final shovelful of dirt. "Honey, let's be practical. It's an expensive hobby, this obsession of yours with Portugal. It's a whim. We have more important priorities." A whim. And now, there it was, the name Lisbon glowing on the computer screen, atop a reservation for a lover's hotel. The word hit her with the force of a punch. He wasn't just betraying their marriage. He was stealing her dream to give it to another woman. He had taken Claire's most intimate and sacred desire, the one thing that was exclusively hers, and was offering it to a stranger, as if it were a bottle of expensive wine brought to a dinner party, a gift to impress. The pain that struck her was of a different, deeper nature. It wasn't just the sharp pain of infidelity, but the dull, corrosive pain of desecration. He knew what that city meant to her. He hadn't just deceived her, he had invalidated her, turning her purest dream into a stage for his sordid affair. That night, staring at the screen that mocked her, Claire understood that she hadn't just lost a husband. She had lost the guardian of her history, only to discover that he was, in fact, its greatest and most cruel plunderer. That betrayal, Claire would later understand, wasn't born from an impulse. It was a construction, a project architected in secret, its foundations laid months before, in small signs, in nearly invisible cracks in the facade of their marriage. Signs that she, the historian trained to decipher patterns, had actively chosen to ignore. It all started with vanity. Richard, who always complained about gyms as torture chambers for egomaniacs, suddenly became a regular attendee. He'd come home late, hair damp and smelling of the sauna, displaying an energy that didn't seem to come from an exhausting day at the office. New, slim-fit linen shirts appeared in the closet, and a cologne, a new, woody and penetrating scent that overpowered the mix of tobacco and lavender she associated with him. It was the smell of a stranger. Then came the cell phone. The device, once a work tool he'd drop at the entryway, became an extension of his hand, an invisible barrier between them. Secret smiles at the screen during dinner, which he'd pass off as a work joke. He started taking it into the shower, claiming to listen to architecture podcasts. The notifications that arrived late at night were always followed by the same hurried whisper, "It's the design team, honey. We're closing a big project." And then a name began to surface in these excuses like a persistent weed. Sophia. At first, it was casual. Sophia, on my team, had a brilliant insight for the new building's facade, but the frequency and intensity changed. He spoke of her with a gleam in his eye, a feverish admiration that Claire hadn't seen directed at herself in years. "The kid's a hurricane. She's going places," he'd say. Claire felt an uncomfortable pang, but she diagnosed it as pride, thinking he was just excited about his new talent. At the same time he was praising Sophia's genius, he became more critical of Claire, as if he needed to diminish her to justify his admiration for the other. "Isn't that dress a little dated?" he asked one night as she was getting ready for a company event. "Babe, can we please talk about something that didn't happen 200 years ago?" he interrupted when she began to share a discovery from her reading. Each comment was a small cut, undermining her self-confidence, and Claire, in her loyalty, found an explanation for everything. "It's the stress from the new project. He just wants to reinvent himself, feel young again. I should be supportive. I'm just being insecure, paranoid." She clung to 20 years of shared history, like a shipwrecked survivor to a piece of driftwood, refusing to believe the sea around her was infested with sharks. She saw the pieces scattered on the floor of her life. The new cologne, the password-protected phone, the name Sophia echoing in their conversations, the growing distance between them. But she refused to assemble them, terrified of the image they might form. She decided, once again, to trust the man she loved, silencing the alarm that was blaring ever louder in her soul. It was a mistake, a bet she would pay for dearly. But the worst was yet to come, and the worst happened. Not with a shout, a slammed door, or a whispered confession in the dead of night. The worst came stealthily, dressed in its Sunday best, on a Friday evening, under the light of a crystal chandelier that Claire herself had chosen. It happened in the middle of their dining room. The dinner was crucial. Richard was courting a German investor for his most ambitious project yet, a cultural complex that promised to be his legacy. Claire had spent 2 days orchestrating every detail with the precision of a military strategist. The menu, a fusion of Midwestern and contemporary cuisine. The wines paired by a sommelier she secretly consulted. The flowers on the table, white tulips, the investor's wife's favorite, a detail Claire had discovered in a business magazine. She was the conductor of a silent symphony, and everything was perfect. The atmosphere was one of restrained elegance. Conversations flowed, and Richard was at the peak of his charm. The conversation inevitably turned to the project. That's when the German investor, a man with graying hair and shrewd eyes named Mr. Adler, leaned forward and asked the question hanging in the air. "Mr. Almeida, your project is impressive in its modernity, but how does it converse with this city's rich history? How does such an avant-garde building avoid becoming a scar on the old fabric of Chicago?" Richard gave a polished, well-rehearsed answer about sustainable materials and lines that mirrored the skyline. It was a good answer, but generic. Claire, feeling the pulse of the conversation, saw an opening. She saw the opportunity not to show off, but to connect the two worlds she inhabited, the past and the present, history and architecture, her world and his. In a calm voice, she interjected, "It's interesting because the idea of the internal courtyards Richard designed, creating areas of respite and silence within the structure, directly echoes the layout of old monastic cloisters from the 18th century. It's a way of creating a refuge, a pause from the outside world, much like the monks did. It's a modern reinterpretation of a very old human need for introspection." It was a brilliant comment. Subtle, intelligent, it not only answered the investor's question, but elevated Richard's project from merely modern to deeply meaningful. Mr. Adler looked genuinely impressed, his eyes lighting up with the new perspective. Richard froze for a millisecond. Claire saw a flash of raw irritation in his eyes before it was quickly masked by a condescending smile. He reached across the table and placed his hand on top of hers. The gesture, to outsiders, might have looked like affection. To Claire, it felt like a gag. "Ah, Claire, my sweet," he said, his voice as soft as velvet but with threads of steel beneath. "Always, with your fascinating history lessons." He let out a small, contained laugh, as if sharing a cute inside joke. Then he turned to the investor, dismissing her completely. "But perhaps we should leave the professional matters to the professionals, shouldn't we? We wouldn't want to bore our guests with academic details." The silence that followed was as heavy and thick as wet velvet. The air grew thin. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. The sound of wine being poured at the other end of the table seemed like a thunderclap. It was then that Claire's eyes, in a desperate search for any sign of solidarity, met those of Sophia, seated next to another architect from the team. Claire expected to see scorn, a gleam of victory, but she saw nothing of the sort. She saw a flash of embarrassment, almost pity. Sophia quickly looked away, her face flushed as if she'd been caught witnessing a private, shameful scene. Claire felt the blood drain from her face, but years of training as the perfect hostess saved her. She forced a smile, pulled her hand out from under Richard's, and said with a lightness that cost her every atom of her strength, "Of course, dear. What was I thinking? More wine, Mr. Adler." She saved the evening. The conversation resumed, oddly animated, as if everyone wanted to fill the vacuum that had formed. But as she smiled and nodded, tasting ashes in her mouth, Claire felt something inside her break. Definitively, he hadn't just dismissed her. He had reduced her to a hobby, a quaint curiosity, in front of the very people whose admiration he craved most. He put her in a box labeled "Interesting Wife," and shut the lid in front of everyone. In that moment, in her own home, surrounded by a success she had helped build, Claire had never felt so profoundly alone and invisible. Claire didn't wait for the conversation to end. With a murmur about checking on dessert, she rose and walked toward the kitchen, feeling dozens of eyes on her back. The service door swung shut behind her, and the sound of the party changed. The polite laughter, the clinking of glasses, Richard's baritone voice telling an anecdote. It all became a distant, muffled noise, the sound of a world to which she no longer belonged. Leaning against the cold marble countertop in the kitchen, she took a deep breath, but the air wouldn't come. It was as if the humiliation had created a vacuum in her lungs. She was an exile in her own home. The food she had planned, the wine she had chosen, the atmosphere she had created, it all continued on perfectly without her, proving what Richard had just told her in no uncertain terms. She was an academic detail. Dispensable. Minutes later, she recomposed her face into a mask of serenity, plated the molten chocolate cake with a perfectly drawn raspberry coulis, and returned to the dining room. She smiled, she served. She accepted the compliments on the divine dessert. She said goodbye to each guest at the door, shaking hands and thanking them for coming, her smile never wavering. On the outside, she was the exemplary hostess. On the inside, she was a field of ruins. When the door closed on the last guest, the silence that filled the house was not peaceful. It was heavy, dense, laden with unspoken words. Richard walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie. Claire waited with a masochistic sliver of hope for an apology, a gesture of remorse. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the ice cracking in the glass with a restrained violence. "Are you insane?" he said, his voice low and cutting. "You almost ruined everything, Claire." "What was that?" Claire stared at him, genuine confusion on her face. "What was what? I was trying to contribute." "Contribute?" He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You don't need to contribute. You need to support. There's a difference. You undermined me. You made me look like an idiot who needs his wife to explain his own work. Mr. Adler doesn't want a lecture on monasteries. He wants to hear about concrete and return on investment. You need to understand your place in these moments. Your place is to be elegant, to smile and to let me shine, not to compete with me." Every word was a blow. Compete. He saw their partnership as a competition. He didn't see her contribution as an act of love and intelligence, but as a threat. The woman whose mind he once said was the most interesting place in the world was now being instructed to remain silent so he could shine. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The words died in her throat, suffocated by the weight of that revelation. She just stood there, motionless, as he finished his whiskey and went upstairs, leaving her alone with the dirty dishes and the wreckage of her self-esteem. The days that followed were a blur of silence and sorrow. Claire moved through the house like a ghost. She found herself questioning everything. Was her intelligence just pretension? Was her passion for history just a useless hobby? Had she become a bitter, pedantic woman? His words echoed in her mind, distorting 20 years of her identity. In a moment of desperation, she tried to apologize, accepting the blame just to break the unbearable ice between them. "I'm sorry about the dinner," she whispered one morning. He just nodded, his eyes on the newspaper, as if the matter no longer deserved his attention. He had already won. It was in this state of absolute fragility, feeling small and worthless, that she sat down a week later to perform the automatic task of organizing the finances. She felt like she was at the bottom of a dark well, with no rope and no light, believing this was her new home. The humiliation had broken her, but she didn't know yet that in breaking, it had created a fissure, a small crack through which a new, dangerous light could enter. At the bottom of the well, sometimes, there's a shift in pressure, an unexpected movement that precedes an eruption. Claire didn't know it yet, but that humiliation wasn't the end of her story. It was the catalyst. She just didn't know that someone was about to change everything. Before we continue this story, I need to pause and ask you something directly. Have you ever felt that way? Completely invisible in the eyes of the person who should see you more clearly than anyone. That pain of having your voice and your value diminished, little by little. If this has ever happened to you, write, "I know," in the comments below. Just so I know you're here with me and that you understand the depth of what Claire was feeling. And so we return to that rainy night, to the credit card statement on the kitchen counter. The humiliated woman, the ghost wife who wandered her own house, now held the first piece of a puzzle that just days before she would have been too afraid to assemble. But fear had been cauterized by humiliation. What remained was a cold curiosity, a historian's need to see all the facts before delivering a verdict. A hotel name wasn't enough. She needed the full story. With silent steps that betrayed the storm in her chest, she went to Richard's office. The space was like him, minimalist, impeccable, every object in its place, a sanctuary of order and control. In the center of the mahogany desk, his tablet lay discarded, still on. A rare oversight, an act of arrogance from someone who has nothing to hide because he believes no one will have the courage to look. Claire's finger hovered over the dark screen for a second. It was the final frontier. Crossing it meant there would be no going back to comfortable ignorance. She touched the screen. No password. The screen lit up, revealing his personal email inbox. And there it was, near the top, an email from the airline with the subject, "Your trip confirmation to Lisbon." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a dull thud in the office's silence. She opened the email, and the truth unfolded before her in stark, relentless black letters. Passengers, Richard Almeida, Sophia Neves. Seats, 15A, window, 15B, middle, Sophia. The name he pronounced with such admiration. The brilliant kid. Oh, did the daughter. There she was, next to his name, on a reservation to Claire's stolen paradise. She scrolled down, her body numb, and saw more. The itinerary he had planned. And a final knife plunged into her heart. A reservation for two, on Friday night, at Club de Fado, one of the most traditional and romantic restaurants in Alfama, a place Claire had circled in a travel guide years ago, a place she had shown him with shining eyes. He had looked over his glasses and said, "Looks too touristy, honey. When we go, we'll find something more authentic." Something happened to Claire in that moment. The pain, which had been a hot, chaotic flood, suddenly froze. It turned to ice. A crystalline clarity, sharp and dangerous, took over her mind. The tears she felt welling up simply dried. Crying was for the woman who was humiliated at dinner. Crying was for the wife who accepted excuses. That woman no longer existed. What she felt now wasn't sadness. It was a glacial fury, a frightening lucidity. She looked at the names, at seats 15A and 15B. She could wake him up, scream, throw the tablet against the wall, make the scene he might even be expecting. But that felt small, insufficient for the scale of this meticulously planned betrayal. A domestic scandal would be forgotten. The historian inside her took control. She wasn't a character in a tragedy anymore. She was the researcher standing before her primary sources. And like any good researcher, she knew the best way to understand history wasn't to scream at it, but to intervene, to change its course. Her eyes fixed on the seat numbers, 15A, 15B, and next to them, on the mental seat map forming in her head, was an empty space. 15C, the aisle. A plan, as insane as it was brilliant, as terrifying as it was liberating, bloomed in her mind. She wasn't going to destroy their paradise from a distance. She was going to take a seat in it. With steady fingers, not a single tremor, she minimized Richard's email window, opened a new browser, and she typed with a supernatural calm the name of the airline. She wasn't going to make a scene. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. She would do something he, in all his arrogant predictability, could never imagine. She would become the omniscient narrator of her own story on the very stage he had set. Buying the ticket was the easy part, a digital act of rebellion that took less than 5 minutes. The real performance, the true test of her new, icy resolve, began the next morning and stretched over the 5 days leading up to the trip. Claire didn't just become an actress, she became the world's best actress in the role of a lifetime, the devoted wife. She woke up before Richard, made his coffee exactly how he liked it, and discussed his schedule with interest. "Don't forget the meeting with the Southern investors, honey. They're important," she'd say, while thinking, "Remember their faces well, because you might not see them again after this." The most surreal scene happened on Wednesday night, as she helped him pack. He held up 2 coats, one wool and one leather. "What do you think? For Venice?" he asked, testing her. Claire took the wool one, felt its soft fabric, and said in the most tender voice she could muster, "Take this one, my love. The nights on the Venice canals can be cold and damp. I don't want you catching a cold." Every word was a perfectly calibrated lie, another brick she laid in the wall she was building around her heart. She watched him rehearse his lie, and she rehearsed hers right back. It was a duet of deceit. The next day, while he was at the office, Claire executed the second part of her plan. With a calmness that surprised her, she called the bank. "Good morning. I'd like to report a lost additional card," she told the agent, her voice sounding concerned. "My husband's, Richard Almeida. He's been so distracted with an important conference in Venice. I'm afraid he's lost it somewhere." She heard the confirmation of the block and felt a jolt of power, a new and addictive sensation. She was, for the first time in years, in control. She was undermining the ground beneath his feet, and he had no idea. Meanwhile, in secret, she packed her own suitcase. It wasn't a suitcase of revenge, filled with dark, sad clothes. It was a suitcase of rebirth. She took out the red silk dress she'd bought on impulse and never had the courage to wear, one Richard would certainly find too flashy. She chose her best shoes, the jewelry she'd inherited from her grandmother and saved for special occasions. This, she decided, was the most special occasion of all. Every piece of clothing she folded was a promise to herself. She was not going to Lisbon to cry. She was going to be seen. Fear, of course, visited her in the quietest hours of the night. A cold sweat would run down her spine as she imagined the scene on the plane, the confrontation, the scandal, the possibility of it all going horribly wrong. In one moment of panic, she almost cancelled the flight, almost reverted to the old Claire, the one who preferred the peace of ignorance to the war of truth. But then she would remember Richard's condescending smile at dinner, the word whim he'd used to describe her dream, and the glacial fury would return, stronger than the fear, pushing her forward. On the morning of his departure, she served him a special breakfast. She kissed him at the door, a rehearsed, lifeless kiss. "Have a great conference, my love. Call me when you get to Venice," she said, looking him straight in the eye. He smiled, the smile of a man who believes he has fooled the world, and left. Claire closed the door and for a long moment stood motionless, listening to the sound of the taxi driving away. The silence in the house was absolute. She had the script, the costume, and the ticket. The stage, a Boeing 777 at 30,000 feet, awaited her. And the final act, she knew, would be irrevocable, a point of no return on her own timeline. But the decision she would make in the air, there would be no coming back from it. O'Hare Airport was buzzing with the anonymous urgency of 1,000 different journeys. But Claire moved through the crowd with a singular purpose, a focus that made her immune to the chaos. She was a hunter. At the departure gate, she sat far away, observing from behind a pair of sunglasses that were part of her costume. She saw them arrive together, laughing, sharing a pair of earbuds. Richard, with his arm possessively around Sophia's waist. They looked like a picture-perfect couple from a commercial, young, beautiful, annoyingly happy. Each of their laughs was a grain of salt in Claire's open wound, but also a drop of fuel on her fire of determination. She waited. She waited for the priority boarding call, for families with children, for the back rows. She waited until the final call, when the gate was nearly empty. Only then did she rise, walk with a calm she did not feel, and hand over her boarding pass. The walk down the jet bridge felt like a corridor to another dimension, a one-way passage. With every step, she repeated to herself, "You are not the victim, you are the consequence." The air inside the plane was cold and recycled. Claire took a deep breath, the smell of plastic and disinfectant filling her lungs. And then she began her slow walk down the aisle, row 10, row 11. The sound of her heart was a muffled war drum in her ears. Row 12. Her gaze was fixed ahead, but her peripheral vision caught everything: a passenger stowing a bag, a flight attendant smiling, the constant hum of the aircraft. Row 14. And then she saw them. They were there in row 15 to her right, settled into their nest of betrayal. Richard was in the window seat, 15A. Sophia in the middle, 15B. He was leaning over her, showing her something on his phone screen, his face lit by a smile of pure satisfaction. Claire knew what he was showing her. Photos of the hotel in Lisbon, their romantic hideaway. Sophia laughed, a genuine, crystalline laugh, and touched his face with an intimacy that made Claire's stomach turn. It was a scene of perfect happiness, a happiness built on the ruins of her life. For an instant, the pain threatened to shatter her armor, but she remembered the dinner, the condescending smile, the word whim, and the armor rebuilt itself, stronger and colder than before. She stopped, right at row 15, and just stood there, silently. Richard was the first to sense her. A shadow in his periphery, perhaps, a shift in the atmosphere. He lifted his head slowly, the smile still on his face, and then his eyes met hers. What happened to Richard's face in the next 3 seconds was a masterpiece of human disintegration. First, confusion, a furrowing of the brow, as if his brain couldn't process the image. Claire, here, then denial, a rapid blink, hoping the mirage would dissipate. When it didn't, came the shock, a white-hot shock that drained all the blood from his face, leaving it pale and slack. His mouth fell slightly open, and finally pure, abject panic, the look of a cornered animal realizing there is no escape route. Sophia, sensing the abrupt shift in emotional temperature, stopped laughing. She looked at Richard's terrified face, and then followed his gaze, turning to the woman standing in the aisle. Sophia's expression was one of pure perplexity, her brow furrowed in a silent, "Who is this?" Claire ignored Richard completely. He was not her audience. With the calm of a goddess of vengeance, she focused her gaze on Sophia. She pulled her boarding pass from her purse, holding it between her fingers as if it were a royal decree. And then, in a clear, polite and terrifyingly neutral voice, she spoke the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. "Excuse me." Sophia stared at her, not understanding. Claire held out the boarding pass so Sophia could read the seat number. "I believe this is my seat, 15C. The world seemed to stop spinning. The hum of the plane, the conversations around them, it all faded away. Sophia looked from the boarding pass to Claire's face, then to Richard's ghostly face, and a terrible understanding began to dawn in her eyes. Richard was petrified, a statue of panic. Without waiting for a response, Claire gestured with her head for Sophia to get up. Stunned, the young woman rose and stepped into the aisle, allowing Claire to pass. Claire settled into seat 15C, the aisle seat. She didn't look at Richard, she didn't look at Sophia. With methodical movements, she stored her handbag, buckled her seatbelt, and in the final act of her power grab, she took from her bag the book she had chosen for the trip. The title on the cover was unmistakable, A Brief History of Portugal. She opened it to the bookmarked page and began to read or pretend to read, creating an island of calm and control in the middle of the nuclear hurricane she had just detonated. The world, in that instant, wasn't the planet spinning in space. It was a microcosm of 3 economy-class seats, suspended at 30,000 feet, where time had stopped. Sophia stood in the aisle, pale. Richard was frozen in his seat, a mask of terror, and Claire, the architect of chaos, turned the pages of her book with a frightening calm. It was a flight attendant who broke the spell. With a professional smile, she addressed Sophia. "Miss, please, I need you to return to your seat. We're preparing for takeoff." The words forced movement. Sophia, like an automaton, returned to seat 15B, squeezing herself between her lover's wife and the man who, she was now beginning to understand, was nothing like he seemed. The physical proximity was unbearable, the air thick with the scent of perfume, lies, and panic. As soon as the plane began to taxi, the barrage started, whispered so as not to alert the surrounding passengers, but every word was a missile. "Who is she, Richard?" Sophia hissed, her face inches from his. Richard just shook his head, unable to form a sentence. "Sophia, please, not here." "Not here? Where did you want to have this conversation? In Lisbon? In the hotel bed you booked for our secret honeymoon?" Her voice trembled with fury. "She's your wife, isn't she?" Claire, without taking her eyes off her book, turned a page with a soft snap, a sound that seemed like a gunshot in the tense silence. We were ending things," Richard stammered, a pathetic excuse that sounded false even to him. "Ending things?" Sophia laughed, a dangerous, joyless sound. "You told me you were already divorced, that it was just a matter of signing the papers, that you hadn't slept in the same room for years." That's when Claire intervened. Without looking up from the page, as if reading an interesting footnote, she commented to the air, "Curious. He snored quite a bit last night. In our bed. Must have been the stress of the trip." Sophia whipped her head toward Claire, eyes wide. The information hit her like a punch. She turned back to Richard, fury now mixed with a nauseating disgust. "You slept with her last night?" Richard looked at Claire, his eyes pleading for silence, for mercy. "Claire, for God's sake, what do you want? Money? Is that it?" Finally, Claire lowered the book. She closed it slowly, marking her page, and turned to face her husband. Her face expressed no anger, no pain, just a clinical interest, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "No, Richard, I don't want money. I want to understand your methodology," she said, her voice calm and cutting. "When you described our marriage to Sophia, did you use the version where I'm emotionally unstable and depressive? Or was that the narrative you created for your mother when she asked why you'd been so distant? I get confused with your versions." Sophia's jaw dropped. "He told your mother I was unstable?" she asked Claire, her anger giving way to a shocked alliance. "Among other things," Claire replied, still looking at Richard. "But I bet for you—" She now addressed Sophia with formal politeness. "He described himself as a misunderstood husband, trapped in a passionless marriage with a frigid, uninteresting woman who didn't appreciate his genius. Am I right?" Sophia was silent, her face a mixture of horror and recognition. It was as if Claire had read the exact script Richard had used to seduce her for months. The two women looked at each other, over the man cowering between them, and for the first time, they didn't see each other as rivals. They saw each other as victims of the same conman. Richard tried one last time. "I love you," he whispered to Sophia, an act of desperation so transparent it was almost sad. Claire laughed, a genuine laugh but without warmth. "Which one, Richard? You need to be more specific. Apparently you have a bad habit of saying that to whichever woman is sitting next to you." At that moment, the plane took off, pressing them all back into their seats. The aircraft's ascent seemed to mirror Claire's own rise and Richard's dizzying fall. As the city fell away below, his world was disintegrating in that single cramped row. He was trapped for 8 long hours in an airborne tribunal he couldn't escape, with his judge on one side and the star witness for the prosecution on the other. The silence that settled in afterward was his sentence, a heavy silence, broken only by the hum of the engines, the sound of the private hell he had created for himself. The following hours on the plane passed in a strange, suspended reality. Richard, trapped between the two women, feigned sleep, a cowardly escape into himself, leaving a vacuum of silence. It was in that vacuum that something unexpected began to grow. After nearly an hour, it was Sophia who broke the silence, not with fury, but with a low, exhausted voice, almost a whisper. "How long have you known?" she asked Claire without looking at her directly. Claire marked her page and placed the book in her lap. She looked at the young woman beside her and saw, perhaps for the first time, not her husband's mistress, but another deceived woman. About the hotel in Lisbon, for a week. About the other signs, for months. About the truth behind it all, maybe only for an hour. The conversation that followed was hesitant at first, two enemy nations negotiating a peace treaty in neutral territory. They didn't talk about feelings, they talked about facts. Like detectives comparing notes, they reconstructed Richard's castle of lies. Claire learned that to Sophia she was a cold, distant wife, living a separate life. Sophia learned that to Claire she was a work colleague Richard professionally admired. Each had been fed a tailor-made narrative, designed to keep them in their respective places, never to meet. And as she spoke, Claire had her great epiphany. The anger she had felt for Sophia, the rage that had fueled her for days, simply evaporated. She looked at this young, ambitious woman who had made the mistake of believing a charming, manipulative man, and she couldn't hate her. Instead, she felt a wave of empathy and an even purer, more concentrated anger toward Richard. And, to her surprise, toward herself. Anger at herself for allowing her voice to become so quiet it was inaudible. Anger for accepting crumbs of attention as if they were a feast. Anger for spending years editing herself to fit into his life, until almost nothing of the original manuscript was left. She understood, in that whispered conversation over the Atlantic Ocean, that the purpose of her trip had transformed. The initial plan, born of pain and fury, was about revenge. It was about exposing Richard, humiliating him, making him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused her. But now, seeing him there, pathetic in his fake sleep, revenge seemed like a consolation prize, small and dull. The real lesson, the true freedom, wasn't in destroying him. It was in realizing that his opinion no longer mattered. The validation she had sought for 20 years, the admiration that was her private sun, had become a dim, yellowed bulb, and she no longer needed it to see. Freedom wasn't the panic on his face, it was the calm in her own heart. The victory wasn't seeing him defeated, it was the unexpected, honest conversation with Sophia. Claire hadn't traveled to Lisbon to confront her husband. She realized she had traveled to say goodbye to the woman she had been for so long, the woman who needed his approval to exist. And that farewell, silent and profound, was the most important divorce of all. The landing in Lisbon was smooth, a contradiction to the emotional turbulence of the last 8 hours. As soon as the aircraft doors opened, Richard moved with the speed of a fugitive. He didn't look back, didn't say a word. In the middle of the airport concourse, as Claire and Sophia waited for their luggage, he just muttered an, "I have to sort this out," and disappeared into the crowd, rushing toward the departures area for the first flight back to Brazil. He abandoned Sophia right there, in a foreign country with a suitcase full of clothes for a honeymoon that would never happen. The Claire of a week ago might have felt a cruel pang of satisfaction, but the woman who stood there, breathing the Lisbon air, felt only pity. She approached Sophia, who was staring into the void, lost. "He isn't worth a single one of your tears," Claire said, her voice firm. "I've booked a hotel for 3 nights. The room is large. Come with me." And just like that, the journey of betrayal transformed into a journey of healing. Together they explored Lisbon. Claire, with her knowledge, became the guide, showing Sophia the cloisters of the Geronimos monastery, explaining the history behind the tiles and cobblestone streets. They went to the Club de Fado, at the very table Richard had reserved, and instead of a romantic toast, they raised their glasses to new beginnings. They laughed, they talked, and in 3 days they built an unlikely friendship forged in the fire of the same deception. A 1.5 years has passed. Claire finalized the divorce faster than anyone expected. She not only resumed her PhD, she completed it with honors, her thesis on the influence of colonial architecture getting published. And then she packed her bags for good. Today, she lives in Lisbon and owns a small, successful tour company called Roots, specializing in historical and cultural itineraries for women traveling solo. She didn't just achieve her dream, she became the dream. Sophia quit Richard's firm the week she got back. With her talent and a new, fierce determination, she opened her own interior design studio. She became known for her ethics and creativity, and her business is thriving. She and Claire video chat every week, a friendship no one could have predicted. As for Richard, there was no dramatic collapse. There was a slow, silent erosion. The story of the Lisbon incident leaked in professional circles, not as gossip, but as a warning about his character. Clients grew wary, partners distanced themselves. His brilliance was overshadowed by his instability. He didn't go bankrupt, but he became smaller, an isolated figure in his minimalist office, a king in an empty kingdom, exactly where he deserved to be. In the end, Claire's greatest revenge was realizing her happiness didn't depend on Richard's fall, but on her own rise. If this journey of overcoming betrayal and finding an unexpected friendship moved you in any way, leave a like to let me know this message resonated with you, and tell me in the comments what city in the US or the world you're watching from. I love to see how far our stories can travel. If you believe every woman deserves to be the protagonist of her own story, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I have many more journeys like this one to share. Thanks for your company. I'll see you in the next video.